This is the presentation for new volunteer counselor orientation for tax year 2021 for Massachusetts District 6 Tax-Aide. Here's the agenda for this presentation. First of all, we're going to talk about the AARP Foundation Tax-Aide National Program. We're going to give you an overview of that. AARP Foundation Tax-Aide District. We're going to look at the district overview for South Shore, Massachusetts. What do volunteers do? We're going to talk about that. What skills do I need to have? How much time will I need to commit? What training will I be given? What do I need to do to obtain certification? And introduction to tax preparation. So we're going to talk about all those things. So welcome aboard. My name is Vern Chartrand. We're glad to have you here. The program absolutely needs new volunteers each year in order to keep the program viable and up to speed over the years. So let's talk a little bit more about it. So the AARP is broken down into two subdivisions. One of them is the division that provides the various products and services that often get advertised in some of the things that we see. And then the other side of the equation is the AARP Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the AARP. So it's really disconnected from the various products and services that you see typically advertised by the AARP, and it's really designed to deal with the charitable aspect of it. So we'll talk more about that. So the AARP Foundation, you can see on this slide, in a comparison to the AARP itself, the AARP Foundation works to end senior poverty by helping vulnerable older adults build economic opportunity and social connectedness. As AARP's charitable affiliate, we service AARP members and non-members alike. Bolstered by vigorous legal advocacy, we spark bold, innovative solutions that foster resilience, strengthen communities, and restore hope. So here you can see some of the programs that typically are provided by the foundation. So here's the logo for the foundation itself. Let's talk about the history of the AARP Foundation Tax-Aide program. We are now finishing our 53rd year, and so we've had a long history. The program started in 1968 with just 4 volunteers out in the western part of the country. We are the nation's largest free volunteer tax program in partnership with the Internal Revenue Service. We're the nation's 4th largest tax prep program, and that's amongst the paid programs or the free programs. It's the 4th largest in the country. 2.5 million people served in 2019, which was prior to COVID-19 and the pandemic. So you'll hear me probably reference data from tax year 2019 because of the pandemic. So things have dropped off considerably since in 2020 and 2021. So 2019 is really the peak of the performance of the tax-aide program. What we're hoping is that 2022 is going to probably rival 2019 because I think we're finally starting to get back on track. So we'll talk about the statistics in the next slide. Let's look at some statistics for tax year 2019. I think you'll be impressed by some of these numbers. We had 4,800 sites around the country, volunteer sites around the country that help service the population as far as getting their tax returns done for free. We had as many as 35,600 volunteers in 2019. We actually prepared 1.6 million tax returns, federal tax returns, and we served 2.5 million people around the country. The total refunds that were paid out in that year because of the work that we did were $1.4 billion. And earned income tax credit, which some people qualified for, we paid out as much as 200 million to these people in 2019. So even though 2020 and 2021 are not as impressive because of the pandemic, we expect that 2022 is probably going to be more in line with 2019. And then moving forward, of course, we expect that the program is going to continue to grow. Now that we've spoken about the national organization, I'd like to now turn to the district organization, which is District 6 here in Massachusetts on the South Shore of Massachusetts. So we have approximately in District 6, 70 volunteers around the district, and the district is really configured pretty much the South Shore of Massachusetts, going from Quincy down to Plymouth in the south, and then westerly off to Route 24. So the boundaries are essentially Route 24, and so we do cover Brockton and Middleborough and areas off to the west, as well as along the east coast from Quincy to Plymouth. So district coordinator for District 6 is Maria Maggio. So all of the local coordinators at the various sites in the South Shore all report to Maria at the district level. And then Maria reports to Joan Gong at the state level. Joan Gong is the state coordinator. So that's essentially the organizational chart in a nutshell. Here's our program objective. The objective is to provide caring, courteous service that results in correct tax returns and the optimum outcome for each taxpayer. And of course, self-fulfillment for our volunteers as well. So what do Tax-Aide volunteers do? Tax-Aide counselors prepare individual, federal, and Massachusetts tax returns for the most part. They also answer tax questions that taxpayers may have either during the process of preparing their return, or in some cases, taxpayers actually come into the various sites just simply to ask a question. Maybe they prepare their own taxes at home, but they run into difficulty and they may come in just to ask us a question. So we need to be prepared to do that. That's essentially what you're going through now with your training. Is we intend to get you up to speed on the various tax law issues so that you can answer some of these questions along the way. Counselors also prepare amended returns. There are a multitude of situations that may require that a tax return from a prior year gets amended. Perhaps we weren't given the correct information in the first place when we prepared the return, and then we discover later on that the information that we had was incorrect. So we can always amend a tax return. I don't think there's any limit to the number of times that a tax return can be amended. So you should never think that when you're preparing a tax return that you're only going to get one shot at this, and if it isn't 100%, that there's no alternative, because there is, and that alternative is to amend the tax return. So you may find after your training that preparing tax returns may not be for you. But what we want you to know is that you need to consider that we have other roles in Tax-Aide that may be more appropriate, may be better suited for you, such as a client facilitator. Client facilitators are very, very important volunteers that we have, that they're essentially screeners, and they screen the various taxpayers when they come in, going through their various documents, making sure that the documents are for the tax year that we are in the process of preparing, and not for some other year. We do get people that come in and basically have all of their documents mixed up so that 19 is mixed in with year 2020 or 2021. So sometimes they just need to be sorted out, and the client facilitators do that. And the client facilitators also ask various questions that the taxpayers need to answer, so that when they finally get to the counselor really has a good idea of what they're dealing with. So the client facilitator role is extremely important, and every site needs client facilitators. So that may be a position you may want to consider as well. We also use communications specialists. These are people that basically deal with the media in any local area. They may just to keep the community aware of the fact that the Tax-Aide program exists and essentially what we do and how we do it, um, and and so that we can continue to get new volunteers every year. So recruiting is part of this. The communication specialists really make sure that the word is out there, letting people know that we need additional volunteers every year. And there's also a tech specialist. So we do a lot of we use laptop computers and printers and routers for Wi-Fi. So all of these things are highly complex. So anybody that has technical experience could be very useful to District 6 or any other district in the country. So we always need tech specialists. It seems like that we never really have enough tech specialists to deal with the various technical issues that come up in the course of a tax season. And then we also have appointment coordinators. Some sites, the local senior centers or in Massachusetts, the COA, sometimes will provide the appointment coordinators, or they will take the appointments themselves and book them for us. In other cases, we actually have our own volunteers booking appointments. I know here in Marshfield, we have an appointment coordinator that's a volunteer that works from home and takes appointments and books them on her computer. And it's been a very good asset to us to have such an appointment coordinator, somebody that's familiar with the clientele that we typically have from year to year. Knowing people by name is always nice. So those are the various other positions that we do have available. And so please don't think that just because the tax preparation process may seem that it's over your head, or so there are other things that we can really use your help with. So just let us know. And you're never alone. There's always somebody at the various sites that can help you with whatever you're doing. So don't feel that once you finish training that you just don't feel real comfortable with the information, because if you get stuck somewhere along the line, there's always somebody there to help you. The local coordinator can help you. Various other counselors can also help you. And we strongly suggest that you seek help and don't try to muddle through a problem on your own. So that's that.
Are volunteers liable? So as a new volunteer, I'm sure that's a question that you would ask. Am I liable for any mistakes that I might make? Tax-Aide volunteers are protected by the Volunteer Protection Act of 1997. As long as volunteers stay within the scope of the program as defined in the scope documents, you would not be liable for anything that goes wrong. And as long as you prepare only the returns that you've been trained to prepare, and for the tax years that you are certified for. And as long as you follow AARP Foundation Tax-Aide policies and procedures. You do not knowingly prepare fraudulent returns. First of all, the IRS standards of conduct is the one thing that you need to agree to when you become a tax-aide volunteer. Each volunteer agrees to comply with the standards of conduct by signing a volunteer agreement, and this is a little bit of what part of the agreement looks like. Here is the rest of the agreement that you'd be signing, and so that's just for you to see. So, do not accept payments. Do not solicit business from taxpayers. Do not knowingly prepare false returns. Do not engage in criminal or infamous, dishonest, notorious, disgraceful conduct. Treat all taxpayers in a professional, courteous manner. And here you can see all of those things repeated. So you need to follow the quality site requirements, QSRs. There are 10 of them. Quality site requirements help ensure the quality and accuracy of the tax return preparation and consistent operation at the sites. Volunteers agree to comply with and follow the 10 QSRs as per the standards of conduct. Here are the 10 quality site requirements. First of all, you need to get certified. You also have to study the intake and interview and quality review process and make sure that you adhere to it. You need confirming photo identification, taxpayer ID numbers. So you need to verify with each taxpayer that you see that their identification has been verified. At many of the sites, that is done by the client facilitator even before you as a counselor gets to see the person. So depending on the site, you may or may not be required to check that ID yourself. You may have somebody before the taxpayer gets to you that has already done that. So it's site dependent. Reference materials, you need to be aware of what your reference materials are, and you need to know how to access them at all times. The volunteer agreement, of course, you need to sign, which we just discussed. You need to make sure that the tax returns are filed in a timely manner. And again, that may or may not be your role at the site that you're at. A lot of times the electronic return originator, the ERO, has the responsibility to make sure the returns are filed in a timely manner, or the local coordinator may have that responsibility. You as a counselor may not have that responsibility, but someone in that site needs to have that responsibility. You also need to ensure that civil rights are maintained at all times. So we do not discriminate against anyone. Correct site identification number. Well, that is not necessarily something that the counselor is responsible for, but somebody at the site needs to make sure that the tax returns that are done with the correct site ID number printed on them. Also, correct electronic filing ID numbers. Again, that's something that the ERO, or the electronic return originator, is responsible for. But a big one is number 10, security. We need to make sure that taxpayer information is kept secure and that there is no risk that their information may be shared by people who are nefarious in nature. Tax-Aide scope. All counselors must prepare only the tax returns that are within scope, and scope is defined in a couple of places. There is a specific Tax-Aide scope manual that is printable or is available electronically online. And also, if you look at publication 4012, there are two types of publication 4012. There's the IRS version, and then there's the NTTC version, which is the National Tax Training Committee under the Tax-Aide banner. So the NTTC modified version has the Tax-Aide in and out of scope table that you can refer to, and it's specific to particular forms. So you can find out whether a particular form is in scope or out of scope for the Tax-Aide program. So you identify out of scope returns as early as possible in the process so that we don't spend a lot of time spinning our wheels on something that ends up being out of scope. So I can't tell you how many times we have actually spent time on issues that ended up being out of scope. So a counselor may spend up to an hour or an hour and a half on a tax return only to discover later on that there's a part of the return that's out of scope. So that's all wasted time at that point. You need to bring it to your local coordinator's attention, and oftentimes those taxpayers are sent somewhere else, and we've wasted our time with them. So we really want to be aware of what's in scope and what's out of scope and try to nail that down as early in the process as possible.
So the next topic is security, privacy, and confidentiality. In the case of in-person tax preparation, where somebody comes to your site and is having their taxes prepared, and the person is going to remain there until the taxes are finished and then is going to leave. In those cases, we do not retain any paper documents or electronic copies of documents or anything of that nature. Once that taxpayer leaves, they leave with everything that they brought with them in the first place. We never keep anything. But in some situations, especially since COVID-19 has been around, there are some sites that have been scanning documents into electronic format, other sites that have been doing what's called drop off, where taxpayers will drop off their paper documents and someone will prepare their taxes and the person will come back several days later perhaps and pick up their tax return. In those cases, there is an IRS form that needs to be filled out, Form 14446. It has to be signed by the taxpayer, giving us permission to hang on to that information for a limited amount of time. So I think the number is 15 days. I don't think we're allowed to keep taxpayer documentation any longer than 15 days. So that generally that's enough time for us to get the job done. The next item on the list is name tags. We expect our volunteers to always wear an identification badge, and the identification badge has to carry their first name and only the first initial of their last name, where we don't put our last name on the badges. We don't divulge the last name information to taxpayers that ask for that information. It will only give the last initial, the first initial of the last name. We also keep confidential the personal information about other volunteers. So we don't talk to taxpayers about personal information about other volunteers, even though they may ask questions about other volunteers. That's private information, and that's to be kept private. We also require that volunteers promptly submit incident reports if there is any lost data. So if by some strange thing that might happen, we lose a document that belonged to a customer, to a taxpayer, or if we had scanned their information and suddenly that information is lost, it was stolen electronically, or so we have to immediately have that escalated to their local coordinator, and the local coordinator will fill out what's called an incident report.
Okay, summary. All volunteers must complete a Tax-Aide policies and procedures training. They must make sure that they're aware of what the policies and procedures are. So there's a training module that you can quickly go through and make yourself aware of those things. That isn't something necessarily that you need to go through at this stage, but perhaps a little bit later on. Pass the IRS volunteer standards of conduct. And the intake and interview quality review tests. So you're going to have some very basic tests. These are very simple tests, easy to pass, very much common sense. So I don't know of anybody that's had difficulty with those particular tests. So it requires that you read a little bit of information about exactly what standard you're being held to and how the process works, and then you answer a few questions, and that's the end of it. So it also requires now that you wear your name tag with your first name and your last initial only. And in summary, also all counselors must pass the IRS intake, interview, and quality review test, not prepare returns that are out of scope. And as I said before, we have a scope manual that you can refer to. Not prepare returns which are what you are not trained to do and you do not have sufficient knowledge to prepare. So you don't want to do returns that you're uncomfortable with because you haven't been trained. Even if it's in scope, if you haven't had the training, effectively it's out of scope. You can bring it to your local coordinator's attention. They can pass it along to someone with more experience than yourself, but don't just dive into something that you have no experience doing. Do not prepare a return if they believe that the taxpayer is not truthful about information provided. So if you get the feeling from a taxpayer that they are not being straightforward with you and not giving you all the information and are trying to pull the wool over your eyes, you do not have to prepare that return. You can let your local coordinator know that you're suspicious of what's going on, and the local coordinator can make a decision as to whether you should proceed with that tax return or not.
What is the time commitment associated with participating in the Tax-Aide program? Well, we have to break it down into two separate categories, one for the training aspect and the other for actually volunteering. Uh, so first of all, the training, the self-study program that we're using last year and this year uh, essentially takes about 40 to 50 hours of mentored self-study over a 6-week period. From mid-October, actually it begins October the 18th, to the end of November. And then additional training is required for Massachusetts especially, and for any updates in the federal tax code that may result from Congress initiating new initiatives in January. So in December and January, the commitment is certainly not as large as it is to study initially to become a counselor, but there will be some training in December and January. Now, after that, the actual tax season, you can plan on 12 to 16 hours per week actually preparing returns. Now, last year, it was a little bit different. There was probably a lot more than 12 to 16 hours a week because we had fewer preparers actually preparing returns, and they were working longer hours. Uh, but in a normal year, 12 to 16 hours is pretty much what most of our volunteers put in. But we're flexible. If we have enough volunteers at a particular site, and some volunteers really only want to only want to volunteer on one day a week instead of two, we can certainly make arrangements for that. And so each site has a schedule that they follow, and they can plug various volunteers into various time slots. And so it varies a great deal. So we count on your commitment, but we recognize that you are a volunteer. We appreciate the fact that you're volunteering, and we make allowances for pre-planned vacations, which a lot of people in the winter months do plan vacations to various places, and we make arrangements for those things. And usually we have enough volunteers that we can get those vacations covered. So what training is provided to the new counselor? Today is effectively your first day of training. We will demonstrate and verify that you can, number one, access Vern's self-study folder on Google Drive. That is a folder that I have set up that basically contains everything that you will need during your training. The same documents that I have in my self-study folder are also accessible on the AARP volunteer portal. They have a folder called libraries, and under that they have training materials. So you can access the same information from either place. I just made it more convenient by putting everything in one place so that you don't get confused by a lot of documents that are unnecessary at this stage. You can download required training materials from the folder that I've set up. You can access Link and Learn lessons and workouts on irs.gov. And I just want to say a little bit about Link and Learn. Link and Learn is a fantastic tool that the IRS has created for new tax preparers, or actually for not only for new tax preparers, but also for tax preparers that want to refresh their memory from the prior year. There's a lot of reading involved, but they make it interesting. Link and Learn has a lot of graphics that keep it more interesting. It's interactive, so they do a lot of quizzing throughout just to make sure that you've retained the information. So it's not as dull as reading a technical manual, for instance. So they've done a good job at really making it more interesting. So this is actually part of the self-study program. It includes Link and Learn, and you'll see how that's all tied together when I go through a demonstration. You'll be able to log on to Practice Lab, which is essentially TaxSlayer Online, which you'll see in future slides. You'll see the TSO. TSO is short for TaxSlayer Online, so This is kind of your first introduction to my use of TSO. You'll be able to enter basic tax return data. Again, my demonstration will show you how to do that. You'll be able to access irs.gov forms and publications, such as publication Pub 17, various other forms and publications on irs.gov, which I'm sure you're already familiar with anyway. So what are the requirements for certification? Well, first of all, we expect that you're going to participate in the self-study program, at least by completing the exercises, which there are many of in the self-study program. As far as studying the tax law itself, we expect that you're either going to use Link and Learn taxes provided by the IRS, which in the self-study program, you're going to see that there are links to there are links all throughout that are going to bring you to Link and Learn so that you can do the associated reading prior to working on the exercise in Tax-Slayer Online. But this year we're also providing the alternative of presentations by various instructors throughout the 6 weeks between October 11th and Thanksgiving, so that you can tune into various slide presentations that the instructors are presenting for the benefit of those that have difficulty reading the Link and Learn modules. So you have two alternatives this year. And if you'd like, I certainly would have no objection to somebody doing Link and Learn as well as tuning into the presentations that we have to offer. So you get a kind of a double whammy as far as information. You have to show confidence in preparing tax returns in TaxSlayer Online by completing at least 4 assigned practice returns. Those returns are going to be intermediate level tax returns that we're going to assign to everybody in the district. So part of the certification process it will include having to complete those 4 returns and complete them correctly. You will pass with an 80% or better score the advanced certification test, which is what all the counselors need to pass, the advanced test. There's also a basic test. I would suggest that you stay away from that because it's really just a subset of the advanced, and you end up being redundant and spending a lot of time on something that you don't need to. You also have to take the standards of conduct test and the intake and interview test. So those 3 tests are required. Those are all provided by the IRS, and we'll show you how to log into your account so that you can complete those exams. But those tests, of course, don't need to be completed until just prior to the tax season beginning, which is usually the beginning of February. So you would want to complete those tests by the end of January. All requirements must be completed before the beginning of tax season. So again, tax season usually starts early February, so you'd have to get all of this done before then.